The principle of mathematical induction says that if a statement is true for 1 and true from k to k plus 1, then it is true for all natural numbers. The contrapositive rule says a statement and its contrapositive are logically equivalent. The proof by contradiction method shows a claim is true by assuming it is false and reaching an impossibility. The triangle congruence rule RHS says right triangles are congruent if the hypotenuse and one corresponding leg match. The law of sines says that in any triangle, the ratios of side lengths to the sines of opposite angles are equal. The law of cosines says that in any triangle, a side length is determined by the other two sides and the included angle. The area formula for a triangle using two sides and the included angle says the area depends on those two sides and that angle. The distance formula in the plane says the distance between 2 points depends on the differences of their x and y coordinates. The circle equation idea says points at a fixed distance from a center form a circle on the coordinate plane. The tangent line criterion says a line is tangent to a circle if it meets the circle at exactly one point. The chord theorem says equal chords in the same circle subtend equal arcs. The perpendicular to chord theorem says the line from the center perpendicular to a chord passes through the chord's midpoint. The arithmetic mean, geometric mean inequality says the arithmetic mean of two non-negative numbers is at least their geometric mean. The Cauchy-Schwarz inequality says the size of an inner product is bounded by the product of lengths. The quadratic discriminant rule says the number of real solutions of a quadratic depends on its discriminant. Vieta's formulas say the sum and product of the roots of a quadratic are determined by its coefficients. The factor theorem says a number is a root of a polynomial exactly when the corresponding linear factor divides the polynomial. The remainder theorem says substituting a value gives the remainder when dividing by the corresponding linear expression. The logarithm product law says the log of a product can be expressed as a sum of logs. The logarithm quotient law says the log of a quotient can be expressed as a difference of logs. The logarithm power law says the log of a power can be expressed by moving the exponent in front. The change of base rule says a logarithm can be converted to another base using a ratio of logs. The inverse relationship says exponential and logarithmic functions undo each other on appropriate domains. The sum-to-1 rule for probabilities says the probabilities of all outcomes in a complete sample space add up to 1. Bayes' theorem says a conditional probability can be reversed by relating it to the reverse condition and the overall probabilities. The addition rule for mutually exclusive events says the probability of A or B is the sum of their probabilities. Linearity of expectation says the expected value of a sum equals the sum of expected values. The variance scaling rule says scaling a random variable scales its variance by the square of the scale factor. For independent variables, variances add when you take a sum. The pigeonhole principle says if you put more objects than boxes, some box must contain at least two objects. The inclusion-exclusion principle counts a union by adding counts and subtracting overlaps. The multiplication principle says if a task has independent stages, the total number of outcomes is the product of stage counts. The addition principle says if choices are made from disjoint options, the total number of outcomes is the sum of the counts. The symmetry rule says if a situation is symmetric, equally likely outcomes can be treated as having equal probability. The proportionality of similar figures says areas scale with the square of the similarity ratio. The proportionality of similar solids says volumes scale with the cube of the similarity ratio. The angle addition rule says an angle can be split into parts whose measures add to the whole. The sign addition formula says the sign of a sum depends on sines and cosines of the parts. The cosine addition formula says the cosine of a sum depends on cosines and sines of the parts. The double angle idea says trig values at twice an angle can be expressed using values at the original angle. The Pythagorean identity says the basic sine-cosine relationship holds for every angle. The unit circle definition says sine and cosine can be defined using coordinates on the unit circle. The distance from a point to a line rule says the shortest distance is measured along the perpendicular. The determinant area rule says the area of a triangle in coordinates can be computed from a determinant expression. The vector addition rule says adding vectors corresponds to placing them head to tail. The scalar multiplication rule says multiplying a vector by a number scales its length and may reverse its direction. The dot product rule says the dot product measures alignment between two vectors. The projection idea says a vector can be decomposed into a component along a direction and a perpendicular component. The parallelogram law says the diagonal of a parallelogram represents the sum of two side vectors. The triangle inequality for vectors says the length of a sum is at most the sum of lengths. The function composition rule says applying one function after another creates a new function. The inverse function composition rule says composing a function with its inverse returns the original input. The monotonicity idea says a function is increasing if larger inputs always give larger outputs. The intermediate value theorem says a continuous function takes every value between two outputs. The factorization principle says rewriting expressions into factors helps reveal zeros and structure. The polynomial degree rule says a non-zero polynomial of degree n has at most n real zeros. The set cardinality rule says two finite sets have the same size if there is a one-to-one correspondence between them. The graph symmetry test says a function is even when its graph is symmetric about the y-axis. The graph symmetry test says a function is odd when its graph is symmetric about the origin. The modulus congruence rule says two integers are congruent mod n if they leave the same remainder on division by n.